My own son handed me a rent invoice for the house I've owned for over 40 years. He'd moved in to help with upkeep, and within 12 months, he was threatening to evict me if I didn't pay. I'm Robert. I'm 71, and today's story is about what happens when someone confuses a spare key with a deed. Grab your snacks, subscribe, and remember, the people in these stories chose wrong. I thought my battles were behind me. I'm Robert, 71, a widower who's owned the same house since my son David was born. When my wife Alina passed, David insisted he move in to help with the upkeep. For a few months, it felt like a gift. Then came the invoice and the quiet demand that changed everything. It all began with a knock on my door I welcomed without a second thought. I opened that door and let my son back into my home with a hug and a sense of relief I hadn't felt in months. Alina had been the center of this house, and without her, the silence was a physical weight. David showing up with 2 suitcases and a determined look felt like the universe throwing me a rope. He laid out the arrangement over coffee that first night. "Dad, you shouldn't be rattling around here alone. Let me handle the maintenance, the bills, the day-to-day stuff. I'll take the guest bedroom, you keep your routine, and we'll look out for each other." He said it with such sincerity, such careful eye contact, that I didn't think twice. I'd raised this boy. I'd taught him how to ride a bike and balance a checkbook. Why would I hesitate? The first 3 months were exactly what I needed. David fixed the gutter that had been sagging since Alina got sick. He repainted the front porch. He cooked on Wednesdays, and we'd sit in the living room afterward and watch old movies the way we used to when he was a teenager. I started to think that maybe, despite the grief, things were going to be okay. I even told my sister Margaret that David was a godsend. But a strange thing happens when you hand someone the reins. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, gratitude can curdle into something else. And the person you welcomed as a guest starts acting like they belong a little more than you do. The first change was the mailbox. David told me he'd switched all the utility bills to his name because it was easier to manage. Then he suggested I give him a small monthly amount for groceries and incidentals, which I did without question. He started taking calls in the other room, lowering his voice when I walked in. He'd say he was discussing work, but the calls always seemed to happen right after he looked at a piece of paper. Then 3 months ago, he asked to borrow the car. "You don't drive it much, Dad. It'll be good for it to get some use." I said yes because he'd been so helpful. I didn't notice until later that the registration slip from the glove compartment was missing my name and his was penciled in. I told myself it was nothing. I was being paranoid. A widower in an empty house sees ghosts everywhere. The day it all changed was a Tuesday. David came home with a leather portfolio under his arm, the kind professionals use. He sat down across from me in my own living room, in the chair Alina used to read in, and he opened that portfolio like he was presenting a business plan. "Dad," he said, "I've been thinking about our living situation. I think we need to formalize things." He handed me a printed invoice with my name at the top. Rent, it said, monthly occupancy fee, and then a number that made my coffee go cold. I stared at it for a long time. "David, this is my house. I've owned it since before you were born." He didn't blink. "Things changed, Dad. I've been managing this property. I've invested my time, my money. At this point, I think it's fair to say the house is effectively mine. You're welcome to stay, but I need you to contribute. If you can't, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." He said it with the same steady voice he'd used to promise me he'd help with the upkeep. And I realized in that moment that the rope I'd been thrown was never a rope at all. It was a leash, and I'd been wearing it for months without knowing. What I did next changed everything. I did not scream. I did not throw him out of the house. I didn't even raise my voice. Somewhere inside me, a version of myself that had navigated 40 years of boardrooms and broken contracts took over, and that version knew one absolute truth: you never show your cards to someone who's just revealed a bluff. I told David I'd review the invoice and get back to him. He looked almost disappointed, like he'd hoped for a fight. Instead, I poured another cup of coffee, sat in my chair, and waited until I heard his car pull out of the driveway. Then I went to work. The first thing any property owner should know is that the truth never lives in someone's words. It lives in the county clerk's office. I drove there that same afternoon, walked up to the records counter, and asked for the deed to my home. Alina and I had bought the place in 1978. We'd paid it off early, celebrated with a bottle of cheap champagne, and never thought about the paperwork again. David was 3 years old. He'd learned to walk in that living room. How could he possibly believe he owned it? The clerk handed me a printed copy. My hands were steady, but my heart wasn't. I scanned the document, and there it was, my name, Robert James Hartley, as sole owner. No amendments, No transfers, no quitclaim deed filed. David's name wasn't anywhere on that piece of paper. He had no legal claim whatsoever. The entire foundation of his threat was constructed on air. I stood in that dusty county office and felt something shift from fear to a very cold, very specific kind of resolve. But here's the thing about discovering one lie: it tends to shake loose other lies you didn't even know you were looking for. And the next discovery was waiting for me at home. That evening, after David went to bed, I did something I'd never done. I walked through my own house as if I were a stranger, looking at it with fresh eyes. I noticed things. The door to the basement, which had always been locked, now had a deadbolt I didn't install. The guest bedroom across from mine, the one David had claimed as his office, had a mini fridge and a coffee maker. And then I opened the closet in the hallway. Inside, there was a second mailbox key, a stack of envelopes addressed to names I didn't recognize, and a handwritten ledger. I sat at the kitchen table and read that ledger. David had been renting out 2 rooms in my house, not occasionally, not to friends. He'd listed them on a short-term rental site, the kind where people book rooms for weeks at a time. The ledger showed a steady stream of payments, nearly $4,000 a month, deposited directly into an account I'd never seen. The names on those envelopes weren't guests, they were tenants. And I, the man who was being handed a rent invoice for my own property, was the last to know. The math was brutal. He'd been living here rent-free, charging strangers to occupy rooms I owned, and then presenting me with a bill for the privilege of staying in my own home. The arrogance of it stole my breath, but I didn't confront him, not yet, because I understood something David clearly didn't. This was no longer a family dispute. This was a legal case, and the paper trail he'd left behind was a gift. The next morning, I called my attorney, James Aldridge. We'd done business together for decades, and he was the kind of lawyer who smiled the widest when a case was airtight. When I told him the story, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Robert, I need to see that ledger, and I need you to not say a single word to your son until I tell you to." That week, we pulled everything. County property records confirmed I was the sole owner. Bank records showed the utility transfers were superficial. The deed, the title, the legal possession had never moved. And those short-term rental listings, the attorney's investigator found screenshots, payment records, and even messages between David and the renters, all time-stamped. It turned out he'd been running this operation for at least 5 months, ever since he'd convinced me to let him handle the household accounts. But the real pivot, the thing that made my blood run cold, came when James looked up from the evidence and said, "Robert, there's more. Your son didn't just pocket rent. He listed you as a dependent on a loan application 6 weeks ago. He used this house as collateral without your name. If he defaulted, the bank would have come after the property, and you would have had no idea until it was too late." I stared at him. The room felt smaller. My own son had tried to use my house as financial leverage while simultaneously threatening to evict me from it. The calculated insult of it, the cold-blooded math, was almost impossible to absorb. But as James laid out the options, something crystallized. David didn't see me as a father anymore. He saw me as an obstacle, and obstacles in his mind got removed. That evening, I sat alone in my living room, in the chair Alina used to read in, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to respond with panic. I wasn't going to respond with anger. I was going to respond with precision. James had drawn up a plan, a legal response so clean, so devastating, that it would give David exactly one choice: face the full force of the law, or accept a path that would force him to rebuild his integrity from scratch. The next step required me to do the hardest thing I'd ever done as a parent. I had to let him dig his own hole deeper. For 3 more days, I said nothing. I watched him walk through my house as if he owned it. I watched him pocket an envelope of cash from a renter who slipped inside while I pretended to nap. And on the 4th day, when James called to say the documentation was complete, I knew it was time. What happened next redefined our entire relationship, and the look on David's face when he finally understood what I had known all along was something I will never forget. I chose a Saturday. David had a routine. He slept in, made coffee around 10, and spent the morning on his laptop managing whatever personal empire he thought he was building out of my spare bedrooms. At 9 o'clock sharp, James Aldridge arrived with a slim leather briefcase containing everything we'd assembled. He sat in the armchair by the window. I sat in Alina's chair. And when David shuffled into the kitchen, still in his robe, I said 5 words that stopped him cold. "We need to talk. Now." He tried to deflect. He said he hadn't eaten yet, that he had calls to make. But then he saw James, and James is not a man you deflect. He's a man who sits very still and watches you with the patience of a glacier. David sat down at the kitchen table. I placed a single sheet of paper in front of him, the county deed, certified, my name in black ink going back 4.5 decades. David glanced at it and pushed it back. That doesn't prove anything, he said. The house might still be yours on paper, but I've put thousands into it. I've managed it. I've made it viable. The law recognizes sweat equity. He said sweat equity the way someone says a magic word they'd looked up online the night before. James didn't smile, but I could feel him wanting to. Then I placed the ledger on top of the deed, the one from the hall closet. His handwritten names, his numbers, his deposit records. For a long moment, David just stared at the cover. His jaw tightened. "That's not yours to take," he said quietly. "You went through my things. You missed the point entirely, son. You've been charging strangers to live in rooms I own, collecting rent you never declared to me, and then billing me for the privilege of staying in a house that has never legally left my possession. That's not sweat equity. That's fraud." David stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. "You have no idea what it's like," he said. "My mother died and left you this house free and clear. I gave up my apartment, my independence, to come take care of you. And what did I get? A pat on the back. You think you can just sit here in your flannel shirt and judge me?" His voice cracked on the last word. I saw it then. The anger wasn't just greed. It was grief twisted into something unrecognizable, but it was still grief. And I knew I had to be careful, because the next thing I was about to say would either break him or save him. James opened his briefcase. He removed a thin folder and laid it beside the ledger. "Robert is not your only victim," he said evenly. David froze. That folder contained the loan application, the one where David had listed me as a dependent and used this house as collateral without my signature. The bank had been ready to issue a line of credit against a property I owned, based entirely on a forged document. If it had gone through, if David had defaulted, the lien would have attached to my home, and the legal mess would have taken years to untangle. I could have lost the roof over my head because my own son decided my signature didn't matter. I watched David's face as he read the application. The color drained from it, not the red flush of anger, but the gray pallor of someone suddenly realizing that a game they thought they were winning has always had consequences they refused to see. "This is a felony," James said. "Simple forgery, fraudulent misrepresentation, attempted theft by deception. In this state, the district attorney takes these very seriously, especially when the victim is a senior." David looked at me, and for the first time since he'd moved back in, I saw my son, not the schemer, not the landlord, not the man who'd handed me an invoice with a straight face. I saw the boy who used to sit on the front porch and wait for me to come home from work, who cried when his mother taught him how to make her lasagna recipe because he was so afraid of getting it wrong. And that boy was terrified. I held up my hand before James could continue. "David," I said, "I'm not pressing charges. I could. Every right is on my side. But your mother would never forgive me, and honestly, neither would I, so here's what's going to happen." The room was silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. David's breathing was shallow. I leaned forward. "You will return every dollar you collected from those renters, all of it, transferred into an account I can verify. You will attend financial counseling, real sessions, with a real counselor, and you'll show me the receipts. You will sign a formal acknowledgement of my ownership, and you will vacate any claim to this property in writing. And for the next 2 years, you will live here as my son, not my tenant, not my manager, and certainly not my landlord. You'll contribute fairly to household expenses, and in return you'll have a place to rebuild. After 2 years, we'll talk about whether you've earned your independence back. Those are my terms. The alternative is that James here calls the county sheriff, and we let the law do what the law does." David sat back in his chair. He didn't speak for almost a full minute. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying. He was just staring at the papers on the table as if they'd rearranged his entire childhood into evidence. Then he whispered, "I'm sorry." I nodded. "I know, but sorry doesn't repay what you took. It doesn't fix what you tried to do. Actions do. So the question now is simple. Are you willing to earn back what you just tried to steal, or are you going to walk out that door and let the system decide who you are?" He looked at me, and for the first time in months, he didn't look like a man holding a leash. He looked like a man being offered a rope. And the decision he made in that moment changed everything that came after. David reached for a pen. His hand trembled, but he didn't hesitate. He signed the acknowledgement right there at the kitchen table, his signature tight and careful, as if the weight of the letters could press the truth into the paper. James witnessed it, filed it with the county the following Monday, and the legal fiction David had constructed collapsed before lunchtime. No drama, no raised voices, just the quiet surrender of a man who finally understood that pretending doesn't make something real. The repayment didn't happen all at once. David couldn't produce $4,000 overnight. He'd already spent most of what he'd collected on credit card debt and a failed online business he'd been hiding. So he worked out a schedule. Every month for 18 months, he transferred a portion of his income into an escrow account that James monitored. Those renters he'd exploited, we tracked them down, every single name in that ledger, and I personally mailed each one a refund with a letter of apology written not by me, but by David. He had to sit at this very table and write those letters by hand, all 14 of them, and for the first time I saw him cry. Not the performative tears of a caught child, but the hot, ugly tears of someone reckoning with what they'd become. The financial counseling was harder. I chose the counselor, a man named Michael Wusu who'd spent 20 years helping people untangle the root causes of their money disorders. David went every Tuesday evening for 8 months. Early on, he'd come back sullen, saying it was a waste of time. Around month 4, something shifted. He started talking about the sessions. About how being unemployed for 2 years after college had planted a seed of desperation he'd never acknowledged. About how losing Elena had cracked something open in him, a fear of abandonment that curdled into entitlement. He'd looked around this house and convinced himself that if he didn't take control, someone else would, and that taking was the only way to feel safe. The logic was twisted, but it was real, and hearing him trace its shape out loud changed the way I saw the whole thing. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who'd let fear drive until the brakes burned out, but knowing why doesn't erase what happened. And there were hard days. Days when I'd find a piece of mail in the old mailbox with his name still on it, and the old anger would rise like bile. Days when he'd slip into his old patterns, asking for an advance on his allowance, and I'd have to remind him that the trust we were rebuilding was measured in years, not months. One evening, about 11 months in, I overheard him on the phone with a friend, laughing about something. The sound was so normal, so light, that I had to sit down in the hallway and collect myself. Because that was the thing I'd been waiting for, not the signed papers or the repaid money, but the return of the son I'd raised, the one who existed before the house became a battlefield. 2 years passed. Not quickly, not easily, but they passed. David found a job he was actually good at, managing logistics for a local shipping company, something he'd never have pursued if he'd still been pretending to be a landlord. He paid off the last of his restitution 2 months early. The counselor signed off on his completion with a letter that said, simply, "Growth is not the absence of failure, but the willingness to confront it fully." And on the morning of the 2nd anniversary of that kitchen table reckoning, David made me a cup of coffee without being asked, set it in front of me and said, "Dad, I don't want this house. I never did. I just wanted to feel like I mattered. And I know now that's not something you take, it's something you give." I looked at him for a long time. Then I pulled out my key ring, removed a small, flat key and placed it on the table. "Safe deposit box," I said. "The deed is in there. It has been since the day after you signed those papers, and it will stay there in my name until I'm gone. But the address on that deed, the home it represents, is yours, not as a possession, but as a promise. The promise that when I'm no longer here, you'll care for it the way I cared for you, not because you're entitled, but because you're ready." David didn't say anything. He just nodded and drank his coffee. And outside, the gutter he'd fixed 3 winters ago held steady through the morning rain. I still wake up some mornings and walk through this house checking the locks, not because I'm afraid someone will break in, but because I'm reminding myself that what's mine has always been mine. The papers prove it. The county records confirm it. But the deeper truth, the one that took me 2 years to fully absorb, is that ownership isn't just a legal status. It's a relationship. And relationships, especially with the people you love, require boundaries that feel cruel to set and essential to keep. If you're in a situation like mine, if someone you trust has started treating your generosity like a resource to be mined, pay attention. The earliest warning signs are small: a shifted bill, a borrowed key, a silence where there used to be conversation. Those small shifts don't fix themselves, they escalate. And the longer you wait, the harder it becomes to separate the person from the behavior. For me, the hardest part wasn't the legal confrontation. It was sitting across from my own reflection in my son's face and choosing to be his father instead of his prosecutor. That choice cost me 2 years of patience, more than a few sleepless nights, and a faith I had to rebuild brick by brick. It was worth it, but I know not everyone gets that ending, and I know that protecting what's yours sometimes means walking away from people who refuse to grow. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt taken advantage of by someone who was supposed to love you, let this be your reminder that silence is not a strategy. Documents matter, county records matter, and your name on a piece of paper still means something. Thank you for spending time with me today. If you found value in this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It's the simplest way to say that stories like this deserve to be told and that you want to be here when the next one arrives. Until then, keep your deeds close, your boundaries clear, and your coffee strong.